What is up, everybody, and welcome back to yet another episode of Tattoo Critiques. I'm Pony Lawson, and you know what we like to do here is talk about your tattoos. This week we're going to be getting into portrait tattoos and what it takes to get them to look as realistic as possible. This is something I do on a daily basis, so I apologize if I get a little too abusive. And this is one I'm personally super excited about, so let's not waste any more time and get right into it. Alright, the first tattoo is sent in from William Strickland. And William, you sent in this Alice Cooper micro portrait that you did on yourself. Alright, I'm happy that you did this one on yourself because I feel like I can talk a little bit more honestly about it without feeling so bad for the person that it's on. The first thing that I noticed right away is all this black hair that's going on in the back. It doesn't seem like there's a lot of texture happening, and it just seems like a very big black void. Sometimes in the references they can be solid black. There may not be a lot of detail shining through because the pictures are very old. When you tattoo such a big area of solid black like this, it doesn't really look realistic. This is where being an artist kicks in. A lot of times when the reference doesn't have those details, it's acceptable to add them in. Especially in a case like this, you can tell what the hair looks like by looking on the edges. Using a liner on the inside of the hair to give it the same shape that's on the edge of the hair will make it look a lot more realistic, even though the reference might not have those details. A lot of times I will tell people not to add extra details to the face if it's not in the reference. However, I think you can get away with a lot of that extra hair detail since that's not where our eyes are focused. Now, aside from the hair, the eyes are the other big thing that I noticed, as they kind of look like big cartoon eyes. Let's take a look at his left eye. If you were to take that upper eyelid line from one side to the other, you'll notice that that glare is intersecting that line, going further than it's supposed to. And with the other eye, the glare isn't going past that eyelid line, but it does look huge already, just making him look like a sad emoji. The line forming the cheek just comes off a bit rough. If you were to add some shading off that line, it wouldn't seem as harsh. And the line for the lip seems like it's gonna disappear. Swap those two lines out, it probably would have came off more realistic. All the shades in the neck and the face just look really patchy. When it comes to micro portraits, finesse is key. You really need to give that nose some proper shape, and you can't do that by just laying in that needle. You can start to build that structure with the 3-liner like you've been using. But off that 3-liner, I would suggest using some sort of small, soft mag just to give it a nice soft shape. You really need to slow down and take your time and make sure each stroke has a purpose. As the hair goes down to the jacket, it kind of gets a little bit lost. We just need some sort of separation because right now it just looks too blurred together. I think it's impressive when I'm looking at portrait tattoos when I see things in dark shadows. The things that are 90 to 95% black, not all the way, but still capture a lot of that detail. It's easy to just blast over everything with black and dark shadows. I think those things are critical when doing micro portraits because you don't have a lot to work with. Overall, I think this looks like a caricature of Alice Cooper. It doesn't quite hit that realism aspect. There are some things that I think you should work on, and that's anatomy with facial planes, and lighting, working with shadow and light. Learn how to finesse those little details in those shadows, because that's what's gonna set you apart. But thank you so much, William, for sending that in and letting me talk about it. All right, the next tattoo sent in is from Tyson Woodward. And Tyson, you sent in this Steve-O mini portrait that you said you did on yourself as well. I do think it's cool that you guys are doing these on yourselves, so you can see what kind of goes into it, see how it feels. And you're not really fucking anybody else up. So right off the bat, first impression, I can definitely tell this is Steve-O. However, much like the last one, this one also kind of feels like a caricature. Y'all know how much I love my line weight, but when it comes to realism in portraits, you have to try and hide those lines as well as possible. The line weights do serve a purpose, you just don't want them to be this noticeable. The bold outline around this tattoo is something you generally see in cartoons or animations, and that's why it kind of feels like a caricature to me. It seems like you're pretty reliant on that liner because you've got some pretty heavy line weight in the hair and in the face as well. Having outlines like this run through the entire tattoo is great for a lot of styles. But when it comes to realism in portraits, you want to try and mask those as well as possible. And you could do so by shading away from those harsh lines. Very smooth, very slow, and consistent. You're not going to get that way by rushing through this thing. Almost every line in this tattoo can be masked by adding a little bit of shading. Something to keep in mind while doing portraits is you want to have a light side and a dark side. This might sound a little confusing, but pay attention to your light source. If your light source is coming from the left, you always want to shade from the right to the left. In this instance, you've got a nice bold outline on the right side of the face and on the left side of the ear. So if we were to use that rule, we would shade from the right side of the line on the face and then move our way to the left. Where the ear is, we would shade from that black line and move left, giving it a nice shadow behind Steve-O. Basically, you almost always want to shade from your darkest shadows toward your light source. Again, these are ways to mask those outlines but still use them in our tattoos. Another general rule of thumb is I only use white highlights where it is shiny, metal, wet, and things like that. You could have got away without using that white in the nose, as right now it's just making that nose cherry red. And I know sometimes I'll use some white in the skin when the picture is overexposed. It's generally all or nothing, but in this case it's such a small spot you could have gone without. There's even a spot in his ear that has a little white highlight that's doing absolutely nothing. You don't need it. This is only going to hurt you when it comes to take your photo. You're going to have red spots all over this tattoo where the white's supposed to be, which if we look at his nose, to be honest, if I were doing this portrait, I would have left the white alone completely and just used it in the glasses. It would have made those reflective parts in the glasses a lot more pronounced. So overall, I think you captured the essence of Steve-O. Yeah, dude. But there are just some technical things I think you need to work on. Thank you so much for sending that in and letting me talk about it. Alright, the next tattoo sent in is from Macy. And Macy, you sent in this portrait of Dr. Martin Luther King. So first impressions. I love this soft shading that you have going on through this tattoo, but I am not a huge fan of this shadow on the outside. I think you could have gotten away with a lot lighter shade on the outside so it doesn't look so much like dark hair. Sometimes when we see these high contrast portraits, we want to put a lot of dark shades on the outside so it makes the light parts pop. But in this case, you really don't need that, as the skin tone of Dr. Martin Luther King is very, very light in this tattoo, so you don't really need to go that dark. I think a 1-drop or a 2-drop shade could have done the job. And to those who aren't familiar, a 1-drop or 2-drop is just 1 or 2 drops of black mixed with your water or witch hazel solution, something to tone it down. One thing that I like a lot about this tattoo is the outline that I believe you used around the outside of the nose, and this is what I was talking about on the last tattoo. If you did use an outline on this nose, you did an exceptional job masking it. I can tell a little more on the bottom that an outline was used, but I think it's strong enough to work. It does seem like the top part of his lip is very thin or missing, as there is a big gap in between his mustache and that lip. I think maybe you went a little too light on that upper lip, so a little extra shading should help out quite a bit. There are a few features that I think kind of got a little away from you. That ear, for example, looks a bit like he's got cauliflower ear. And there's just something off with the eyes. I can't exactly nail down what it is. Maybe they just seem too soft. Alright, so I actually pulled the reference up so I could dive a little bit deeper into this portrait. After comparing this to the actual reference, I did notice that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. does have very prominent eyelashes, which I've noticed your portrait doesn't have any. And eyes are the very first thing we see when looking at a portrait, so you want to make sure that's the one thing that you send home. I also noticed that his cheek is sagging a little bit when looking at the reference. Of course, that's nothing that you can't remedy by adding just a little bit more shade to. You've definitely lost a lot of shade in that lip. When looking at that reference, there's a lot there, and I don't really see that in your portrait at all. So when I first opened this tattoo, I knew right away that it was Martin Luther King Jr. And there were some things that I liked about this tattoo that I didn't like so much about the previous tattoos. But now that I've opened up the reference, I'm finding a few more things wrong with it. I think the nose is probably the best part about this tattoo, but I do think that it's lacking shades overall. Something I do that I think would help a lot of portrait artists is knowing where those ultimate whites are. What I mean by that is, if you were to print this reference off on a piece of paper, the only parts of your tattoo that should be skin tone are the parts that don't have printer ink. Everything else should have some sort of shade in it, even if it's a very, very light wash. Not having those shades in there against those heavy whites is going to immediately flatten everything. And this face next to the reference definitely comes off as flat. So Macy, I do think a lot of your technical application is on point. You have some very soft shading. I just think you need more of it in the right places. Learning where to put those shades is really going to shape your portraits. And making sure you're not adding background just to add background, but finish it off and give it a purpose. Thanks a lot, Macy, for setting that in. Alright, the next tattoo sent in is from Alia, and Alia, you sent in this portrait of Freddie Mercury. Right off the bat, I can tell it's Freddie Mercury, but he does seem like he's got quite a skinny face. Likely that's from the portrait just being too big and the stencil wrapping. That's one unfortunate thing about realism and portraits, is a lot of times we don't draw them on, so the stencil forms and bends with the body. You have to kind of keep that in mind before executing a portrait like this. How much is it going to bend? Is it going to make the face look very skinny? Those are a couple things that you have to think about before doing a portrait of this size. A way you could have prevented that is probably by making this portrait a bit smaller and maybe adding a few elements in the tattoo as well that represent Freddie. Maybe a microphone, some words, or something along those lines. When you do it on a little smaller scale, it doesn't distort the edges so much. Other than that, I think you've got some good details in this tattoo. The eyes, for one, are very beautiful. On the left side of the hair, you've got just enough skin tone showing through to give it some texture, which if you remember from some of the other tattoos we've seen, a lot of people like to just fill that in solid black, and it doesn't look real. But if you look toward the right side of the hair, that's when we kind of fall flat. Adding just a little texture into that hair in that part is going to make that hair seem that much more believable. Take the mustache for example. That mustache looks like a bunch of little hairs because of the textures. The shadow under the chin onto the neck just comes off a bit harsh. You've almost got too much shadow going on here to where it seems like the head is just floating, or it's just way too big for that body. His nose shade just kind of comes over a bit too much into the center of the nose, where it makes his nose look a lot thinner than it actually is. I do love the little stitching detail that the artist added into that tank top, although I wish I would have seen a bit more. Maybe bring that tank top down a hair more just to match up with the bottom of that shadow. Looking at references of Freddie Mercury, he has a lot more angled chin than the artist gave him. Had that angle been cut a little more sharp, it would have given his face a lot more shape. I do think the eyes are the best part about this tattoo. Everything else just needs a little bit of work. It's really not that bad, it just seems a hair rushed. But overall, I think you've got some really good details in this tattoo. I just think the size and placement make it seem a lot thinner than he actually is. So thank you, Alia, for sending that in. Alright, the next tattoo sent in is from Ava Jordan. Ava, you've mentioned you've watched a few of my videos in the past and they've actually helped out your tattooing skills so much. Well, thank you very much, first of all, for watching my videos, and I'm glad you got something out of them. Let's see what you've learned. So you sent in a Lana Del Rey portrait. I have no idea who Lana Del Rey is. I know I've heard the name before, but I couldn't tell you what she looks like. Right off the bat, I like this tattoo quite a bit. I think it's got a lot of the right elements in the right places to make this tattoo work. There are a few small things that I want to bring up and discuss, but for the most part, this is a great looking tattoo. So one thing I noticed right away is her right nostril sits a bit lower than her left, and I think that's because you made the right side of her nose just a hair too short. The bottom seems even, just not the top. I do like the lack of shading throughout this tattoo, allowing the person's skin tone to do a lot of the work. You've got a lot of heavier black shading on the outside of this tattoo, so it's nice to see that contrast. The hair detail that you have in this tattoo I think is exceptional. It seems like you're aware of what I like to call the V-shape rule when it comes to hair. And what I mean by that is hair either originates or ends in a V-shape almost every single time. When we look at the left part of her hair, you can tell that even that long strand of hair is originating from and ending in a V-shape, as well as all the other little V-shapes that are surrounding that long strand. I do want to reiterate that I'm not only very impressed that you're an apprentice, but you also did this tattoo on yourself. There are a lot of things in this tattoo that I see that most apprentices lack. So excellent job, once again. I'd bet that you've probably been drawing portraits your entire life, or close to it, because you can tell that you just naturally understand a lot, even before the technical application comes into play. So Ava, overall, I think this tattoo is pretty striking. It's just that nose that bothers me. But other than that, I think you nailed it. And you know what? Let's just leave this tattoo up, because I think it's pretty obvious that this is the best tattoo we saw today. This thing has a lot of things going right for it, and I don't care so much that it's done by an apprentice, or that it's done on yourself. Although those are two really impressive things. This is just a very, very good tattoo. So I think this tattoo deserves Tattoo of the Week. So congratulations, Ava, and thank you once again for sending it in and letting me critique it. But we're not finished yet. I do want to share with you guys somebody who I think is one of the top in the portrait game. Not only is he a big inspiration to me, but he is a huge influence to tattooers across the globe. If you're already in the portrait game, then I'm sure you're already familiar with his name. And if you're not, let me introduce David Vega. David Vega is an absolute monster when it comes to black and white portraits. I don't think anyone really comes close to his soft, buttery-like shading. In this episode, we talked a lot about hiding or masking outlines in a tattoo. Go look at any one of David's tattoos and it will be a perfect example of how to shade away from those darker outlines. Another thing we discussed is keeping details in those darker shadows. When you look at David's work, especially in the hair, in those darker areas, you're gonna see those nice little details, and it's amazing. So make sure you head on over to David's page, give him a follow, a bunch of likes, and let him know I sent you. Alright, I appreciate you guys sticking around to the very end of the video. And thank you guys so much for sending in your tattoos. And if you want to send in your tattoo, you can do so by sending it to ponycritiques@gmail.com. Be sure to label whether or not you're an artist or collector, and hopefully we'll see it on a future episode. Until then, see y'all next week.